What would drive a 21-year-old college student to destroy the lives of over 50 men? As Rachel Carter is escorted out of her apartment in Austin, Texas, by police, neighbors whisper in shock. Flashing lights bounce off the walls of her small building, casting long shadows across the street. Rachel doesn't resist. Her expression is blank, yet her body seems burdened by the weight of something far greater than the charges she's about to face. Who is Rachel Carter? And what secrets lie behind the door the officers just walked her out of? This moment marks the end of one of the most unsettling cases in recent history. But it's only the beginning of a story that would leave a trail of broken trust, shattered lives, and haunting questions. Welcome to True Crime IQ. Thank you, my viewers. Thank you for joining me as we unravel the chilling stories that keep us questioning the limits of trust, love, and betrayal. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest gripping tales. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't forget. Let's begin. Rachel wasn't always the person being paraded out in handcuffs. In fact, just a few years earlier, she was the picture of innocence. Born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, she grew up in a devout household where faith and discipline ruled. Her parents emphasized humility, modesty, and a moral compass that guided Rachel's every decision. Her childhood was ordinary, her days structured, her nights filled with family prayers and routines. But this small-town life was a far cry from the independence and unbridled freedom she would encounter when she moved to Texas for college. Austin was different, louder, more unpredictable. It was a world of opportunities and temptations. Rachel tried to stay grounded, clinging to the values her family had instilled in her. But as the pressures of college life mounted, cracks began to form. Those cracks widened on a humid Friday evening in May. A party invitation came from a classmate she hardly knew. At first, Rachel said no. The idea of attending a wild, alcohol-filled night felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. But her friends insisted. "It's just one night," they said. "What's the harm?" That night, Rachel Carter crossed a line she could never return from. It was a Friday evening in May, and the warm Texas air hummed with anticipation. Rachel Carter stood at the edge of a sprawling suburban lawn, her fingers gripping her phone as she hesitated to take the next step. Inside, music pulsed against the walls, laughter spilled into the night, and the smell of alcohol mixed with freshly cut grass. Rachel's upbringing in Charleston, South Carolina, had taught her discipline, restraint, and a clear sense of morality. Her parents had always reminded her that temptation was everywhere, but she never imagined she'd feel it like this. For weeks, Rachel had watched her peers celebrate the end of the academic year with wild parties and carefree nights. She had resisted the pull every time. But tonight was different. Her friends had insisted she come along, and against her better judgment, she found herself here, on the doorstep of a world she had always observed from a distance. She adjusted her modest yet stylish dress, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The house was packed with students. The bass from the speakers vibrated through the floor, and the energy in the room was electric. People danced, sang, and shouted over the music, their faces flushed with excitement. Rachel felt out of place immediately. She scanned the room, hoping to find someone she knew well, but instead, she saw only familiar faces in passing, a reminder of just how isolated she had kept herself. As the night wore on, Rachel's initial discomfort began to wane. A friend handed her a drink, a fruity cocktail that smelled harmless enough. She hesitated before taking a sip, the taste both sweet and unfamiliar. It was her first drink, and with it came a warmth that loosened her inhibitions. For the first time in her life, Rachel felt as though she belonged. The laughter, the music, the carefree atmosphere. It was all intoxicating. She didn't notice her posture relax or her smile become more genuine. The walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble. It was during this haze of newfound confidence that Rachel noticed him, Brandon Miller. He was standing near the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter, his broad shoulders and easy smile commanding attention. Brandon was the kind of person who seemed effortlessly charismatic, the center of every conversation without trying. Rachel didn't approach him, but it didn't matter. Brandon noticed her first. With a drink in hand, he made his way over, his smile widening as he closed the distance between them. "First time at one of these?" he asked, his voice smooth and inviting. Rachel nodded, her nerves making her laugh softly. "Is it that obvious?" Brandon chuckled, his eyes locking onto hers. "A little, but it's not a bad thing. It's refreshing. Their conversation flowed easily. Brandon had a way of making Rachel feel comfortable, as though she were the only person in the room. He leaned in when she spoke, his laugh coming easily at her jokes. He complimented her in ways that felt sincere, pointing out things she had never thought anyone would notice. Rachel felt a connection she hadn't anticipated. For so long, she had kept herself guarded, afraid of stepping out of line or tarnishing the reputation her family held dear. But Brandon seemed different. He listened intently, his charm disarming her completely. As the night progressed, Brandon became her anchor in the chaotic swirl of the party. He offered her another drink, and then another. With each sip, Rachel felt herself letting go of the doubts and fears that had always held her back. When Brandon suggested they go somewhere quieter, Rachel hesitated. The echo of her parents' warnings whispered in the back of her mind, but the alcohol dulled her caution, and the thrill of the moment pushed her to follow him. The next morning, Rachel woke up in Brandon's apartment. The events of the night before played back in fragments, the laughter, the connection, the way Brandon had looked at her. For the first time, she had stepped outside of her comfort zone, and for a brief moment, it had felt exhilarating. But that feeling didn't last long. Brandon's warmth from the night before was gone. He was distant, his attention elsewhere as Rachel tried to make conversation. She felt the sting of rejection as he walked her to the door with a polite but curt goodbye. Days turned into weeks, and Rachel tried to reach out to him. Her calls went unanswered, her messages left unread. Confusion turned into frustration, and frustration into heartbreak. It was during this time that Rachel began to feel unwell. Persistent fatigue, headaches, and a fever that wouldn't go away led her to the campus clinic. She sat in the sterile examination room, waiting for answers, never imagining the news she was about to receive. The doctor's words hit her like a freight train. "You've tested positive for HIV." Rachel's mind went blank. The room seemed to close in around her as she clutched the test results in her trembling hands. How could this have happened? She had always been so careful, so cautious. The answer came to her in a devastating flash: Brandon. Determined to understand how her life had unraveled so quickly, Rachel began reaching out to people who knew Brandon. Through fragmented conversations, she uncovered a truth more devastating than she could have imagined. Brandon had known. He had been aware of his diagnosis long before the night they met, and he had chosen not to tell her. Rachel wasn't the first person he had deceived, and she likely wouldn't be the last. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Rachel had ever experienced. The man who had made her feel special, who had made her feel like she belonged, had stolen her future in a single, selfish act. As she sat alone in her dorm room, staring at the ceiling, Rachel felt her heartbreak harden into something else: anger. Her life had been derailed, her trust shattered, and in her mind, Brandon had walked away without a single consequence. That night, Rachel Carter made a decision. If Brandon could destroy her life without facing the fallout, then perhaps it was time for her to take control. After the diagnosis, Rachel Carter's life became a blur of anger, confusion, and despair. She spent hours alone in her apartment, replaying every moment with Brandon Miller, dissecting every word he had said, every look he had given her. What had felt like a moment of belonging had been nothing more than a cruel lie. She stopped attending classes, her once meticulous routine slipping away. Nights were the hardest. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her shallow breaths and the relentless thoughts that kept her awake. Anger began to take root, overshadowing the shame she felt. How could someone knowingly destroy her life? How could Brandon walk away without consequences? These questions festered, and with each passing day, Rachel felt the need to reclaim control. The Rachel Carter of Charleston, South Carolina, the girl who clung to the values her parents had taught her, began to fade. In her place, a new Rachel emerged. One who wasn't content to suffer in silence, one who wanted to ensure the pain she felt didn't end with her. Rachel knew she couldn't act as herself. She needed a new identity, one that would allow her to move unnoticed. And so, Mia Harper was born. The transformation was meticulous. Rachel spent weeks creating Mia's persona, carefully curating an online presence that was equal parts alluring and approachable. Her profile picture was carefully chosen, tasteful yet enticing, a photo that suggested innocence while hinting at mystery. Her bio was simple, looking for something real. Rachel knew the type of man she wanted to target. She wasn't interested in the young and carefree. She wanted those who would risk everything for a moment of escape. Men who had families, careers, and reputations to protect. Her first step was joining dating platforms. She created profiles on multiple apps, each tailored to appeal to a specific type of man. Mia Harper could be whoever she needed to be: a college student, a freelance artist, or a woman navigating a complicated divorce. With each identity, Rachel's confidence grew. Michael Hayes was the first. A married father of two from San Diego, California, Michael was a 39-year-old accountant whose messages to Mia quickly revealed his dissatisfaction with his life. At first, his words were polite, almost guarded. But as their conversations continued, he began to open up, sharing his frustrations with his job, his family, and the monotony of his day-to-day routine. Rachel played her role flawlessly. She responded with just enough vulnerability to make Michael feel like the one in control. She laughed at his jokes, complimented his insights, and encouraged him to talk about himself. By the time he suggested meeting in person, he was already emotionally invested. They met at an upscale restaurant in San Diego. Rachel arrived early, dressed in a modest yet flattering outfit. She projected an air of shyness, subtly reminding Michael that he was the one leading the interaction. Over dinner, she listened intently, her expression a perfect mix of curiosity and admiration. When Michael suggested continuing their conversation somewhere more private, Rachel didn't hesitate. At the hotel, she guided the evening with precision, ensuring every detail aligned with her plan. But as she left the hotel room hours later, Rachel felt something unexpected. The triumph she had anticipated was overshadowed by an emptiness that clung to her like a shadow. She walked through the quiet streets of San Diego, her mind racing. This was only the beginning, but it already felt heavier than she had imagined. Rachel's first encounter didn't deter her. If anything, it fueled her. She returned to her apartment and opened her laptop, logging the details of her evening in a password-protected file. Michael Hayes, 39, accountant, married, 2 children. Over the next few weeks, Mia Harper became a fixture on dating apps. Rachel mastered the art of manipulation, tailoring each interaction to her target. A businessman looking for excitement, a college professor feeling trapped in his marriage, a police officer curious but cautious. Rachel could be anyone they needed her to be. Her encounters became methodical. She would initiate conversation, establish trust, and suggest meeting in person. Once face-to-face, she exuded charm, her actions calculated to lower her target's defenses. Rachel kept meticulous records of each man she targeted. Names, professions, locations. It was all there, stored in a file that felt more like a ledger of accountability. But as her list grew longer, so did the toll on her health. The initial energy that had driven Rachel began to wane. She stopped sleeping through the night, haunted by memories of her own betrayal and the faces of the men she had deceived. Her appetite disappeared, leaving her gaunt and exhausted. Despite the physical and emotional toll, Rachel pressed on. Each new encounter felt like a step toward regaining control, even as the satisfaction she sought remained elusive. The woman who had started this mission with righteous anger now moved through her days like a machine, her actions fueled by habit rather than conviction. Amidst Rachel's carefully planned encounters, there was one she didn't anticipate: Derek Williams. A 23-year-old architecture student from Boulder, Colorado, Derek was far removed from the types of men Rachel usually targeted. When Rachel first connected with him, she almost dismissed him. Derek's profile was simple, unpolished, and lacked the overconfidence she had come to expect. He seemed hesitant, his messages polite and thoughtful. But something about his unassuming demeanor caught Rachel's attention. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe near Rachel's apartment. When Derek arrived, it was clear he was nervous. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his hands fidgeted with his phone as he waited for her. But when Rachel approached, he smiled, a warm, genuine smile that disarmed her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Derek's presence was different. He didn't carry the air of entitlement or bravado that Rachel had grown accustomed to. Instead, he seemed unsure of himself, his words carefully chosen, his laugh soft and genuine. What was supposed to be a brief coffee date stretched into hours. Derek spoke with quiet passion about his dreams of becoming an architect, his childhood in Colorado, and the small joys he found in life. His optimism was infectious, and Rachel found herself drawn to his sincerity. Their conversations were unhurried. Derek listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and sharing pieces of himself in return. Over time, Rachel began to let her guard down. She shared fragments of her childhood, stories she hadn't spoken about in years. One evening, As they walked through a park, Derek pointed out the beauty in the small details around them. The way the light filtered through the trees, the sound of birds settling in for the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel wasn't consumed by anger or regret. In those quiet moments, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she was missing. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Derek's presence was steady, grounding Rachel in a way that none of her other encounters had. He didn't see her as a mystery to unravel or a conquest to be won. He saw her as a person, and that terrified her. Derek's kindness forced Rachel to confront parts of herself she had buried long ago. As he spoke about his dreams and hopes, she saw a reflection of the person she used to be, the girl who once believed in love and trust, in a future filled with possibilities. But with every moment of happiness, there was an undercurrent of guilt. Rachel knew she was living a lie. Derek didn't know who she really was, what she had done, or the truth about her diagnosis. At night, as she lay awake, Rachel's thoughts raced. How could she continue to build a relationship with someone who saw her as good, as worthy? And yet, the idea of losing Derek was unbearable. Her time with Derek became a mirror, forcing her to see the contrast between the life she was living and the life she could have had. It was as though Derek had reached through the walls she had built around herself, exposing the humanity she had tried to bury beneath her anger. Rachel knew she couldn't keep the truth from Derek forever. The weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing day. She rehearsed the conversation in her mind, imagining every possible reaction. Would he hate her? Pity her? Walk away without another word? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Rachel decided it was time. They were sitting on a bench by the river, the soft murmur of water creating a sense of calm around them. Derek was recounting a story from his childhood, his face lit with nostalgia. But Rachel barely heard his words. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. Derek turned to her, his expression shifting to concern. "What is it?" Rachel hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. Then, with a deep breath, she began. She told him everything, her diagnosis, her betrayal by Brandon Miller, and the path of destruction she had chosen in her anger. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted to infecting more than 50 men, each encounter meticulously planned as part of her misguided mission for vengeance. Finally, she confessed how meeting Derek had changed her. "I don't want to hurt anyone anymore," she said, her voice breaking, "but I don't know if I can ever escape what I've done." For a moment, Derek said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the rippling water in front of them. Rachel's heart felt like it might shatter under the weight of the silence. Finally, Derek turned to her, his voice quiet but steady. "You've made mistakes, Rachel. Terrible ones. But that's not all you are." His words hit her like a wave. Rachel's tears came harder now, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over her. "I don't know what this means for us," Derek continued, "but I know I'm not ready to walk away." Rachel nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. While Rachel Carter's life seemed to be moving in a new direction with Derek Williams, her past was quietly catching up to her. Unknown to Rachel, complaints from men who had been her victims had begun to surface. Some pieced together her identity through dating platforms, others shared their experiences after noticing patterns that were too similar to ignore. These complaints sparked a months-long investigation. Detectives worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, combing through digital trails, dating profiles, and hotel records. What they found was startling: multiple aliases, meticulously crafted personas, and an alarming number of encounters that pointed to a calculated mission. Law enforcement agencies tracked Rachel's movements, compiling evidence that painted a grim picture. With each new piece of information, the case against her grew stronger. It was a quiet evening when Rachel's world came crashing down. She was sitting in her apartment, scrolling through her phone, when a sharp knock echoed through the room. At first, she thought it might be Derek, but as she approached the door, the sound of voices outside gave her pause. Peering through the peephole, Rachel's stomach dropped. 2 police officers stood on the other side, their expressions firm. "Rachel Carter," one of them asked as she opened the door. Rachel's voice faltered as she replied. Before she could process what was happening, she was being read her rights. The words felt distant, muffled, as the realization of what was happening began to sink in. Neighbors watched from their windows as Rachel was escorted out of the building in handcuffs. The flashing lights of police cars illuminated the night, casting shadows across the quiet street. Rachel's face remained expressionless, but inside, her mind was racing. This was the moment she had feared but never truly prepared for. Her actions, the aliases, the encounters, it had all caught up to her. Rachel's trial became a media sensation. The courtroom was packed every day, reporters scrambling for details as the story made headlines across the country. The prosecution laid out a damning case, presenting evidence that included digital records, testimonies from victims, and Rachel's own meticulous notes. Each detail painted a picture of someone who had deliberately and methodically targeted her victims. One by one, the men took the stand. Some spoke through tears, their voices trembling with anger and betrayal. Others stared directly at Rachel, their words sharp and unyielding. They described how Rachel had manipulated them, how she had gained their trust only to betray them in ways they could never have imagined. The emotions in the courtroom were palpable, waves of sadness, anger, and confusion that seemed to hang in the air. Rachel sat quietly through it all, her head bowed, her face unreadable. But amidst the sea of condemnation, one person stood apart. Derek Williams attended every session, slipping into the back of the courtroom and sitting quietly, his presence a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He didn't speak to Rachel, didn't make his presence known to anyone else, but she saw him every time. His face, a mixture of sorrow and determination, was a constant reminder of the person she had been trying to become. For Rachel, Derek's silent support was both comforting and agonizing. It was a sliver of hope in an otherwise bleak reality, a reminder that someone still saw her as more than the sum of her mistakes. When the verdict was finally delivered, the air in the courtroom felt heavy. Rachel was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As she was led away, Derek approached her. For the first time since her arrest, their eyes met. His words were soft, meant only for her. "I still love you," he said, "and I'll wait for you." Rachel couldn't find the words to respond. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, her emotions a tangle of relief, guilt, and sorrow. Prison was a stark new reality for Rachel, but it was also a place where she began to confront the weight of her actions. Through therapy, she started to unpack the anger and betrayal that had driven her choices. Slowly, she began to piece together the person she used to be. Rachel poured her thoughts into writing, crafting a memoir that detailed her life, her mistakes, and the lessons she had learned. The book gained attention, with proceeds going to organizations that supported victims of HIV and trauma. Inside the prison walls, Rachel also found purpose in helping others. She became a mentor to women who carried their own burdens of pain and regret. She shared her story not as an excuse but as a warning, a reminder of the destructive power of unresolved anger. Rachel Carter's story is one of pain, betrayal, and choices that left a lasting impact on countless lives. But it's also a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there's room for reflection, redemption, and hope. As Rachel looks out from her prison cell, one question remains. What would you have done in her place? Could you forgive? Could you find the strength to rebuild? At True Crime IQ, we bring you stories that challenge your perspective and reveal the complexities of human choices. If this story moved you, support us by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription helps us uncover the stories that matter. Hit subscribe and join us as we explore more tales of resilience, redemption, and humanity.